The excessive heat gripped the streets of a sleepy neighborhood on that promiseless afternoon. An elderly lady pushes her grandson's stroller over the hot asphalt, following the same path as always. In the stroller, the baby fidgets when passing, an empty house pointing insistently at a pile of rubble. The woman stops, confused, and approaches a box hidden among trash bags. Inside, a dehydrated German shepherd struggles to breathe, eyes closed and body stretched out. In the background, no sound, not even a bark, not a whisper. The baby stares, his hand extended toward the box, and for a second, everything stopped. Love. Stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thanks for following us. Now, back to our story. The heat was unusual for the time of year in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and the suburban neighborhood seemed to be immersed in a kind of silent torpor. The cracked sidewalks reflected the sun with uncomfortable intensity, and even the everyday sounds, the buzzing of insects, the sporadic barking of some distant dog, the gentle rustling of leaves swaying in the wind, seemed to have been muffled by a thick layer of thermal exhaustion. It was an ordinary afternoon, one of those where nothing seems about to happen, when everything presents itself in its most routine monotony. But sometimes it's precisely in the predictability of days that life decides to change quietly. Margaret Thompson walked slowly down the sidewalk with her grandson Tommy in his stroller. It was their usual afternoon route, a brief walk through the quieter streets, just so he could see the movement, feel the wind, and observe the birds. Margaret, at 72, had been taking care of 3-year-old Tommy twice a week since her daughter Claire returned to work at the local hospital. These walks had become sacred moments between grandmother and grandson, filled with Tommy's excited pointing at every squirrel and his delighted giggles when a butterfly crossed their path. But that day, when they passed in front of an apparently empty house on Maple Street, Tommy became unusually agitated, his blue eyes fixed on something ahead, and he began pointing insistently, making urgent sounds somewhere between calling and discomfort. Margaret, at first, thought it was an animal or object that had caught the boy's interest, but as his crying intensified and his gestures became more acute, she decided to stop. The residence was in evident abandonment, the overgrown garden, the rusted gate, and the sidewalk overtaken by dry leaves and small branches. The for sale sign had been there for months, weathered and faded. Near the gate, almost merged with the shadow of the wall, there was a cardboard box, partially hidden between 2 garbage bags. It wasn't large, but it appeared to have been sealed with excessive duct tape. Margaret, intrigued and uncomfortable with Tommy's crying, approached hesitantly. "What is it, sweetheart? What do you see?" she asked softly, though she knew Tommy's vocabulary was still limited. His pointing became more frantic, his little finger jabbing toward the box with increasing urgency. When she stopped in front of the box, Margaret heard a muffled sound, irregular, like labored breathing. That's when she felt the first chill run down her spine. There was something alive in there. The box moved slightly, confirming her worst fears. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, her heart racing. Margaret looked around frantically for help. The street was deserted except for her and Tommy. She pulled out her phone and called her neighbor, Robert Martinez, who lived just 2 blocks away. "Robert, this is Margaret. I need your help immediately. I'm on Maple Street, near the Hendersons. Old house. There's an animal trapped in a box and I can't open it alone. I'll be right there, Margaret. Don't do anything until I arrive." While waiting, Margaret tried to calm Tommy, who had stopped crying but continued staring at the box with an intensity that unsettled her. She noticed the box was branded with shipping tape that looked industrial, not like something a regular person would use for storage. There were no markings, no address labels, nothing to indicate where it came from or how long it had been there. Robert arrived within minutes, still wearing his mechanic's coveralls from work. He was a stocky man, in his 40s, with calloused hands and a kind demeanor that had made him the unofficial neighborhood helper. "What exactly did you hear?" he asked, kneeling beside the box. "Breathing, Robert, labored breathing, and this thing is heavy. Look at how the cardboard is bending." Together, they carefully moved the box to a more open area. Robert pulled out his utility knife and began cutting through the excessive tape. As they peeled back the cardboard, Margaret held her breath, not knowing what they might find. What they discovered inside made both of them gasp. It was a German Shepherd, fully grown, lying on its side in the cramped space. The dog was panting heavily, its eyes half closed and its body trembling with exhaustion. It was clearly dehydrated, with no room to move, and had obviously been left there for hours, maybe even a full day. "Jesus," Robert muttered under his breath. "Who would do this to an animal?" The dog looked up at them with eyes that held a mixture of fear and hope. Despite its weakened state, there was something noble about its bearing, something that suggested this wasn't just any stray dog. "We need to get him to a vet immediately," Margaret said, her voice shaking with both anger and determination. "There's the Cedar Rapids Animal Hospital on First Avenue. It's only 10 minutes from here." Robert carefully lifted the large dog, surprised by how the animal didn't resist or show aggression despite its obvious distress. "He's heavier than he looks, but not as heavy as he should be. Poor thing's probably hasn't eaten in days." They managed to get the dog into Robert's pickup truck, with Margaret following in her car with Tommy, who had been unusually quiet throughout the entire ordeal. As they drove to the animal hospital, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about how Tommy had somehow sensed the animal's distress from the sidewalk. Children often had an intuition that adults lost over time, but this seemed almost supernatural. At the Cedar Rapids Animal Hospital, Dr. Sarah Chen immediately took charge. She was a 38-year-old veterinarian who had built a reputation for handling emergency cases with both skill and compassion. Her staff quickly moved into action, and within minutes, the German Shepherd was on an examination table connected to IV fluids. "This dog has been severely neglected," Dr. Chen announced after her initial examination. "Dehydrated, malnourished, but surprisingly, his vital signs are stable. He's fighting hard to survive." Margaret sat in the waiting room with Tommy on her lap, both of them watching through the glass partition as the veterinary team worked. She noticed how calm Tommy had become once they'd found the dog, as if he'd known all along that help was what the animal needed. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Chen called out 20 minutes later. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Margaret joined the veterinarian in the examination room, where the German Shepherd was now receiving treatment. The dog looked better already, though still weak. "We found something interesting," Dr. Chen said, holding up a small scanning device. "This dog has a microchip. That means he's not a stray. He had a registered owner. We're running the chip number through our database now." "A microchip?" Margaret was surprised. "Then someone reported him missing?" "That's what we're going to find out. But Mrs. Thompson, I have to say, the condition this dog was in suggests deliberate abandonment rather than accidental loss. Dogs don't just end up sealed in boxes by accident." Margaret felt a surge of anger at the thought of someone deliberately harming such a beautiful animal. What kind of person could do such a thing? The kind of person who sees animals as objects rather than living beings with feelings, Dr. Chen replied grimly. "But let's focus on helping him recover. We'll keep him here for observation and contact the registered owner to get some answers." As Margaret prepared to leave with Tommy, she found herself reluctant to go. Something about this dog had touched her heart deeply, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than mere coincidence. "Dr. Chen, would it be all right if I checked on him tomorrow? I feel responsible for him now." "Of course, Mrs. Thompson. Actually, his recovery might be faster with familiar faces around. Animals often heal better when they feel they have someone who cares about them." Driving home, Margaret kept glancing at Tommy in his car seat through the rearview mirror. He had fallen asleep, but his little hand was still pointing in the direction they'd come from, as if he was still thinking about the dog they'd left behind. That evening, as Margaret prepared dinner, she couldn't stop thinking about the German shepherd's eyes. There had been something deeply intelligent and sorrowful in them, something that suggested this animal had experienced both training and trauma. She found herself wondering about his story, about who had owned him, and most importantly, who had decided he was no longer worth keeping. Her daughter Claire called that evening to check on how the day had gone with Tommy. "Mom, you sound different. Is everything okay?" Margaret told her about the afternoon's events, about Tommy's unusual behavior, and about the dog they'd rescued. "That's incredible, Mom. Tommy's never been around dogs much. How did he even know something was wrong?" "I don't know, sweetheart, but I've been thinking about it all evening. There was something almost destined about the whole thing, like Tommy was meant to find that dog." "You're not thinking of adopting it, are you, Mom? You've never had a large dog before." Margaret paused, surprised by her own immediate response. "Actually, Claire, I might be considering exactly that." The next morning, Margaret woke with the German shepherd on her mind. She had dreamt about him throughout the night, vivid dreams where the dog was running free in a large field, healthy and happy, with Tommy laughing beside him. She couldn't remember the last time a dream had felt so real or significant. After dropping Tommy off at daycare, Margaret drove straight to the Cedar Rapids Animal Hospital. Dr. Chen met her at the entrance with a troubled expression. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm glad you're here. We've made contact with the registered owner, and I'm afraid the situation is more complicated than we initially thought." They walked to the back of the clinic, where the German shepherd was resting in a large kennel. He looked significantly better than the day before. The IV fluids had helped, and his eyes were brighter and more alert. When he saw Margaret, his tail gave a weak but definite wag. "His name is Max," Dr. Chen began. "He belongs to a man named David Sterling, who lives in a more affluent part of Cedar Rapids. When we called him yesterday evening, Sterling claimed the dog had been missing for weeks and that he'd been searching everywhere for him." Margaret knelt beside the kennel and extended her hand toward Max. The dog sniffed her fingers and then gently licked them, a gesture that made her heart swell with unexpected emotion. "But," she prompted, sensing there was more to the story. "But several things don't add up. First, there was no missing pet report filed with animal control. Second, when we checked with local veterinarians, none had seen Sterling searching for a lost dog. And third, most telling of all, Max has a chronic respiratory condition that requires medication that Sterling didn't mention when we asked about Max's health history." Margaret stood up, her face flushing with anger. "You think he abandoned Max because of his illness?" "I'm beginning to suspect exactly that. We ran extensive tests last night. Max has a mild respiratory condition that makes it difficult for him to handle intense physical activity, but it's completely manageable with medication and proper care. For a pet, it's a minor issue, but if someone was using this dog for breeding or guard work, they might see it as a defect that makes him worthless," Margaret finished, her voice thick with disgust. Dr. Chen nodded grimly. "There's more. Our veterinary technician, James, used to work at a facility that trained guard dogs. When he saw Max this morning, he immediately recognized signs of professional training. Watch this." Dr. Chen opened the kennel and gave Max a subtle hand signal. Immediately the dog sat at attention, his posture perfect, his eyes focused. She made another gesture and he lay down with military precision. "That's not pet training," she explained. "That's professional security training. Max was likely trained as a guard dog or for protection services. With his respiratory condition, he probably couldn't perform the physical demands of that job anymore." Margaret felt sick to her stomach. "So they just threw him away like garbage?" It appears so, but here's where it gets interesting and why I wanted to talk to you. Sterling wants Max back. What? Margaret's voice rose sharply, causing Max to look up with concern. She lowered her voice and reached down to stroke his head reassuringly. After abandoning him to die in a box? That's the thing. Sterling insists he didn't abandon Max. He claims Max went missing and that someone must have taken him. He's threatening legal action if we don't return his property immediately. Margaret's mind raced. But the box, the location where we found him, surely the police can investigate. We've reported the incident, but without concrete proof of abandonment, it becomes a case of his word against circumstantial evidence. The police detective assigned to the case, Detective Lisa Rodriguez, is sympathetic, but she needs more evidence. As if summoned by their conversation, a woman in plain clothes appeared at the clinic entrance. Dr. Chen introduced her as Detective Rodriguez, a woman in her early 40s with sharp, observant eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Mrs. Thompson, I understand you're the one who found Max yesterday. Margaret nodded and recounted the entire story, from Tommy's unusual behavior to the discovery of the box. Detective Rodriguez took detailed notes and asked several follow-up questions. I've spoken with Mr. Sterling this morning, the detective said. His story has some inconsistencies. He claims Max disappeared 3 weeks ago, but his neighbors say they saw Sterling loading a large box into his car just 2 days ago. Can't you arrest him? Margaret asked. Not without more evidence. Animal abandonment is a serious charge, but I need proof beyond reasonable doubt. Sterling is claiming the neighbors are mistaken about the timeline, and the box could have contained anything. Dr. Chen interjected, Detective, there's something else. I've been in contact with 2 other veterinary clinics in the area. One of them treated a German Shepherd belonging to Sterling about 2 months ago. The dog came in with signs of stress and overwork, but Sterling refused the recommended treatment regimen when he found out it would be ongoing and costly. That's helpful, Detective Rodriguez acknowledged. I'm building a case, but these things take time. In the meantime, the law says Sterling has the right to reclaim his property, regardless of our suspicions. Margaret felt her heart sink. When? He's coming this afternoon with proof of ownership to take Max home. The thought of Max returning to someone who had abandoned him was unbearable to Margaret. She looked down at the German Shepherd, who seemed to sense the tension in the room. His breathing had become slightly labored. Whether from his condition or stress, she couldn't tell. What if I adopted him? Margaret asked suddenly. Could I make an offer to buy him from Sterling? Detective Rodriguez and Dr. Chen exchanged glances. Mrs. Thompson, the detective said gently, I appreciate your concern, but Sterling seems determined to keep possession of Max. However, there might be another option. What do you mean? Dr. Chen smiled for the first time since Margaret had arrived. Iowa state law requires that animals with chronic medical conditions be provided with appropriate ongoing care. If Sterling takes Max home and fails to provide the necessary medication and treatment, that would constitute animal neglect. We could set up monitoring visits, Detective Rodriguez added. I have a contact at Animal Control who specializes in welfare checks. If Sterling doesn't maintain Max's medical care, we'd have grounds for removal. Margaret felt a glimmer of hope, but was still troubled by the immediate problem. But what about today? What happens when Sterling comes to get him? Legally, I have to release Max to him, Dr. Chen admitted, but I'm going to make sure Sterling understands exactly what Max's medical needs are. I'll provide detailed written instructions for his care, and I'll schedule a follow-up appointment for next week. If he doesn't show up for that appointment, it will be evidence of neglect, Detective Rodriguez finished. Margaret spent the next hour sitting with Max, talking to him softly and stroking his fur. The dog seemed to understand that something was about to change, and he stayed close to her, occasionally resting his head on her knee. You know, Margaret told him. My grandson Tommy saw you when no one else did. Maybe he knew you needed help, or maybe he knew you were going to need someone to watch out for you. Either way, I'm not giving up on you. At 2 o'clock, David Sterling arrived at the clinic. He was a tall, well-dressed man in his 50s, with cold grey eyes and an impatient manner. Margaret disliked him immediately. I want my dog back, he announced to the receptionist without any pleasantries. Dr. Chen emerged from the back room with Max on a leash. Sterling barely glanced at the animal, instead focusing on the paperwork. He needed to sign. Mr. Sterling, Dr. Chen said firmly, Max has a chronic respiratory condition that requires daily medication and regular veterinary monitoring. I have a detailed care plan here that you need to follow exactly. Sterling waved dismissively. Yeah, just give me the dog. I know how to take care of my own property. His use of the word property made Margaret's skin crawl. Max, however, had an interesting reaction to seeing Sterling again. The dog didn't show excitement or recognition as one might expect with a beloved owner. Instead, Max's posture became rigid and submissive, his tail tucked between his legs. I'll also need to schedule a follow-up appointment for next week, Dr. Chen continued. Max needs blood work to monitor his response to the medication. Fine, whatever. Just schedule it, Sterling said, clearly eager to leave. As Sterling attached a leash to Max's collar, Margaret stepped forward. Mr. Sterling, I'm Margaret Thompson. I'm the one who found Max yesterday. Sterling looked at her with annoyance. Well, thank you for finding my dog, Mrs. What was it again? Thompson. And I want you to know that I'll be checking on Max's welfare. Sterling's expression darkened. Lady, this is my dog, and what I do with him is none of your business. Maybe next time you should mind your own affairs, instead of taking other people's property to the vet. Margaret felt her temper rising, but managed to keep her voice steady. When I found Max, he was nearly dead from dehydration and starvation. That's not the state of a dog that simply got lost. Are you accusing me of something? Sterling's voice turned threatening. Detective Rodriguez, who'd been observing quietly from the corner, stepped forward and showed her badge. Mr. Sterling, I'm Detective Rodriguez. We're investigating the circumstances of how Max ended up in that box. I'll be in touch if I have any questions. Sterling's demeanor changed immediately when he saw the badge. I've told you everything I know. The dog went missing, and somehow he ended up in that box. I don't know how it happened, but I'm grateful these people found him. I'm sure you are, Detective Rodriguez replied with a knowing look. Sterling tugged on Max's leash more roughly than necessary. Come on, let's go home. Margaret watched helplessly as they walked toward the exit. Max looked back at her once, his eyes expressing something that broke her heart. She had seen that same look in rescue animals before, resignation mixed with a plea for help. As Sterling's car pulled away, Margaret turned to Dr. Chen and Detective Rodriguez. This isn't over, is it? Not by a long shot, the detective assured her. Sterling doesn't realize it yet, but he's about to be under constant surveillance. And Mrs. Thompson, I have a feeling you're going to play a crucial role in ensuring Max's safety. Margaret nodded firmly. You can count on it. That dog deserves better, and I intend to make sure he gets it. Little did any of them know that Max's story was about to take an even more dramatic turn, one that would reveal not only Sterling's true nature, but also an unexpected talent that would change multiple lives in ways none of them could imagine. Margaret couldn't shake the image of Max's resigned expression as Sterling had led him away. For the next 3 days, she found herself driving past Sterling's house on Oakbrook Lane, a street lined with large suburban homes in one of Cedar Rapids' more expensive neighborhoods. Each time, she saw no sign of Max in the yard, no evidence that the dog was being walked or cared for properly. On Wednesday morning, Claire stopped by with Tommy for their usual visit. Margaret was unusually quiet as they sat in her kitchen, Tommy playing with blocks on the floor. Mom, you've been distracted ever since that business with the dog. Are you okay? Margaret sighed, watching Tommy stack his blocks with the same focused intensity he'd shown when spotting Max's box. I can't stop thinking about him, Claire. That dog trusted us to help him, and we essentially handed him back to the person who tried to kill him. You don't know for certain that Sterling abandoned him. I know, Margaret interrupted more sharply than she'd intended. I'm sorry, sweetheart, but my instincts are telling me something is very wrong, and I've learned to trust my instincts over the years. As if summoned by their conversation, Margaret's phone rang. Dr. Chen's name appeared on the caller ID. Mrs. Thompson, I have concerning news. Sterling never picked up Max's medications yesterday as scheduled, and he hasn't returned my calls about the follow-up appointment. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. Have you contacted Detective Rodriguez? I was about to, but I thought you should know first. Also, I received a call this morning from Animal Control. A neighbor on Oakbrook Lane reported hearing a dog whimpering continuously since Monday night. Margaret was on her feet before Dr. Chen finished speaking. I'm going over there right now. Mrs. Thompson, please be careful. If Sterling is neglecting Max, confronting him directly could make things worse for the dog. After hanging up, Margaret turned to Claire. I need you to call Detective Rodriguez and tell her to meet me at Sterling's house immediately. Something's wrong. Mom, maybe you should wait for the police. Claire, every minute we wait could be another minute Max suffers. I'm going. Margaret drove to Oakbrook Lane with a sense of urgency she hadn't felt in years. Her late husband had always teased her about her mother-hen instinct, her inability to ignore anyone or anything in distress. Today, that instinct was screaming. Sterling's house was a large, Tudor-style home with an immaculate lawn and garden. As Margaret parked across the street, she could hear what the neighbor had reported, a faint but continuous whimpering coming from somewhere on the property. She walked up to the front door and rang the bell. No answer. She rang again, hearing the sound echoing through the house. The whimpering seemed to be coming from around back. Margaret made a decision that surprised even her. She walked around to the back of the house. What she found there made her blood boil. Max was chained to a tree in the backyard with a short, heavy chain that barely allowed him to stand properly. He had no shelter, no food bowl visible, and only a small dish of water that appeared to have been empty for some time. The dog was lying on his side, clearly in distress, his breathing labored and raspy. "Oh, Max," Margaret whispered, rushing to him. The dog lifted his head weakly when he saw her, his tail giving the faintest wag of recognition. Margaret pulled out her phone to call 911, but she heard a car door slam in the front driveway. Panicking, she crouched beside Max and spoke softly to him. "Help is coming, baby, I promise." Sterling appeared around the corner of the house, his face red with anger. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" Margaret stood, her own anger overriding any fear. "I'm looking at what appears to be animal abuse. This dog needs immediate veterinary care. Get off my property before I call the police." "Please, do call them. I'd love for them to see this." Margaret gestured to Max's condition. Sterling's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming defensive. "The dog destroyed my house. He's being punished until he learns some discipline." "Punished?" "He's sick, Mr. Sterling. He has a medical condition that requires medication and care, not being chained outside without proper shelter. That dog cost me $3,000 in training, and he turned out to be defective. He can't handle the work I needed him for, and now he's acting out because he's not being used." Margaret stared at Sterling in disbelief. "So you tried to get rid of him by leaving him in a box to suffer?" "I don't know what you're talking about. I told you." "And the police? He went missing and conveniently ended up sealed in a box less than a mile from here." Sterling stepped closer, his voice menacing. "Mrs. Thompson, I strongly suggest you leave my property immediately. This is your final warning." Margaret heard the sound. of sirens in the distance. She smiled grimly. I don't think I'll be leaving just yet. Detective Rodriguez arrived first, followed quickly by an animal control officer named Janet Webb, a woman in her 30s with a stern expression and a confident bearing. Dr. Chen arrived shortly after, having left her clinic to respond to the emergency. Sterling's entire demeanor changed when he saw the authorities. Officers, this woman is trespassing on my property. I want her arrested. Detective Rodriguez walked over to examine Max's condition, her expression growing darker. By the moment, Mr. Sterling, when did you last provide this animal with food and water? This morning, Sterling lied smoothly. Dr. Chen was already kneeling beside Max, checking his vital signs. This dog is severely dehydrated again and showing signs of heat exhaustion. Based on his condition, I'd estimate he hasn't had adequate food or water for at least 2 days. Janet Webb took photographs of the scene, documenting the inadequate shelter, the heavy chain, and Max's condition. Mr. Sterling, where are the medications that Dr. Chen prescribed for this animal? Sterling hesitated. They're inside. Could you bring them, please? Sterling disappeared into the house and returned 5 minutes later, empty-handed. I can't seem to find them at the moment. That's because you never picked them up, Dr. Chen stated firmly. I have records showing you never came to collect them. Detective Rodriguez stepped forward. Mr. Sterling, I'm placing you under arrest. For animal neglect, you have the right to remain silent. As the detective read Sterling his rights, Margaret felt a mixture of relief and vindication. But her primary concern remained Max, who was clearly in need of immediate medical attention. Dr. Chen, will he be okay? With proper care, yes, but he needs to get to the clinic immediately. Dr. Chen carefully lifted Max, noting how the dog didn't resist despite his weakened state. Mrs. Thompson, would you be able to meet us at the clinic? I think seeing a familiar face might help him. As they loaded Max into Dr. Chen's van, Margaret noticed something she hadn't seen before. Despite his weakened condition, Max's eyes showed no fear, only a sort of patient endurance, as if he'd always known someone would eventually come for him. At the clinic, Dr. Chen and her team worked quickly to stabilize Max. Margaret watched from the waiting room as they administered fluids and medication. Tommy was with Claire at home, but somehow Margaret felt certain that if he were here, he would know that Max was going to be all right. 2 hours later, Dr. Chen emerged with good news. He's stable and responding well to treatment. With proper care, he should make a full recovery. Dr. Chen, what happens to Max now? Sterling is in custody, but what about the dog? Legally, Max will be held as evidence while the case against Sterling proceeds. However, given the circumstances and the need for ongoing medical care, the court will likely allow him to be placed in a foster home rather than remaining in the animal control facility. Margaret took a deep breath, knowing she was about to make a decision that would change her life. I'd like to foster him, and if possible, I'd like to adopt him permanently. Dr. Chen smiled broadly. Mrs. Thompson, I was hoping you'd say that. I think you and Max have a very special connection. There's something else, Margaret said thoughtfully. I work as a volunteer at the Cedar Rapids Senior Center twice a week. The residents there often feel lonely and isolated. I've been thinking maybe Max could come with me sometime. If he's well enough, of course. Dr. Chen looked intrigued. That's an interesting idea. Many therapy dogs are specifically trained for that kind of work, but they require certification. However, given Max's professional training background, he might be a natural for it. Margaret looked through the window at Max, who was resting comfortably on a thick blanket in the clinic's recovery area. Something Tommy had done still puzzled her. How had a 3-year-old child sensed an animal in distress from so far away? And why did she feel so strongly drawn to this particular dog? As she watched Max sleep, Margaret had the distinct feeling that their story together was just beginning. What she didn't know was that Max's greatest gift wasn't his training as a guard dog, but rather an extraordinary ability to connect with humans in their most vulnerable moments. An ability that would soon transform not just Margaret's life, but the lives of many others in ways she could never have imagined. Detective Rodriguez appeared in the waiting room, interrupting Margaret's thoughts. "Mrs. Thompson, I wanted to update you on Sterling's situation. He's been charged with animal neglect and abandonment. Given the evidence we've gathered, including his lack of care and the neighbors' statements about the box incident, I'm confident he'll face serious consequences." "What about Max? Will Sterling have any claim to him?" "Under Iowa law, animals that are the subject of neglect charges can be forfeited by the court. I'll make sure the prosecutor knows about your interest in adopting Max. Given your role in his rescue and your willingness to provide proper care, I think the court will look favorably on your petition." Margaret felt tears of relief welling up in her eyes. "Thank you, Detective, for everything." As evening approached, Margaret prepared to leave the clinic with the promise that she could visit Max again the next day. Dr. Chen walked her to the door. "Mrs. Thompson, I have a confession to make. In 20 years of veterinary practice, I've rarely seen such an immediate bond between a human and an animal. It's almost as if you two were meant to find each other." Margaret smiled, thinking about the series of events that had led them to this moment. "You know, Dr. Chen, I'm starting to believe that too." 2 weeks later, Margaret walked into the Cedar Rapids Senior Center with Max on a leash, both of them nervous but hopeful. The court had granted her emergency custody of Max pending Sterling's trial, and the German Shepherd had made remarkable progress under her care. His breathing was better, his coat had regained its shine, and most importantly, he seemed to be remembering how to trust humans again. Margaret had been volunteering at the Senior Center for 3 years, ever since she'd retired from her job as a library administrator. She'd always enjoyed the time she spent there, reading to residents, helping with activities, and simply providing companionship to those who rarely had visitors. But she'd never brought Max before, and she wasn't sure how he would react to the environment. "Mrs. Thompson, is this our visitor?" asked Linda Martinez, the center's activity director. Linda was a warm, energetic woman in her 40s who had been enthusiastic about Margaret's suggestion to bring Max for a trial visit. "This is Max," Margaret replied, gently tugging on the leash to bring the dog forward. Max sat immediately, his posture perfect, his dark eyes surveying the new environment with calm intelligence. The main activity room held about 15 residents, most in wheelchairs or mobility chairs, others sitting on comfortable sofas and chairs. Their ages ranged from the mid-60s to the late 90s, and many looked up with curiosity as Margaret and Max entered. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Margaret's friend Max," Linda announced. "He's here to visit with us today." Margaret was amazed by Max's immediate transformation. The alert, somewhat guarded dog she'd grown to know became gentle and intuitive, as if he instinctively understood that he was in the presence of people who needed special care. Without any command from Margaret, he lowered his body slightly and moved slowly toward the nearest resident, an elderly woman named Dorothy who was sitting in a wheelchair. Dorothy, who suffered from Parkinson's disease and rarely engaged with visitors, held out a trembling hand. Max approached carefully and placed his head gently beneath her palm, allowing her to pet him without any exertion on her part. "Oh my," Dorothy whispered, her voice barely audible. "Aren't you beautiful?" Margaret watched in wonder as Max seemed to adjust his behavior for each resident. With Frank, a World War II veteran who suffered from mobility issues but had sharp mental faculties, Max sat at attention and responded to the man's commands as if sensing his military background. With Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman recovering from a stroke who had limited speech abilities, Max simply lay down beside her chair and rested his head on the armrest, providing silent companionship. But it was with Harold Peterson that Max showed his most remarkable behavior. Harold was 86 years old and had been largely uncommunicative since arriving at the center 6 months ago following a mild stroke. His daughter Susan visited regularly, but often left in tears because her father seemed to be retreating further into himself with each passing week. Max approached Harold slowly and deliberately. The old man sat in his wheelchair, staring off into space as he usually did, seemingly unaware of his surroundings. But when Max placed his paw very gently on Harold's lap, something remarkable happened. Harold's eyes focused. He looked down at Max, and for the first time in months, his face showed recognition and interest. His hand, which had been limp in his lap, slowly reached forward to touch Max's head. "Good boy," Harold said clearly, his voice stronger than anyone had heard in months. "You're a good boy." The room fell silent. Linda gasped softly, and Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. Harold hadn't spoken a coherent sentence in weeks, and here he was, not only speaking, but showing animated interest in Max. For the next hour, Margaret watched as Max worked his magic throughout the room. He seemed to instinctively know which residents wanted to play, offering his paw to those who could manage it, and which ones simply needed quiet companionship. With Rose, a former teacher who had dementia, he sat patiently as she told him rambling stories about her classroom days, his head tilted as if he were truly listening. When visiting time was over, Margaret had to coax Max away from the residents. He seemed reluctant to leave, especially Harold, who had continued to speak in short but clear sentences throughout the visit. "Mrs. Thompson," Linda said as they prepared to leave, "I've never seen anything like this. Max has a gift." "I've noticed it too," Margaret admitted. "It's like he knows exactly what each person needs from him. Would you consider making this a regular thing? Perhaps once a week. I think our residents would benefit enormously from spending time with Max." Margaret looked down at Max, who was sitting patiently while she considered the proposal. The dog looked up at her with those intelligent eyes, and she could swear he understood every word they were saying. "I think Max would like that very much," she replied. Over the next few weeks, Margaret and Max developed a routine. Every Tuesday afternoon, they would spend 2 hours at the senior center, and the improvements in the residents were remarkable. Harold Peterson became the star success story. His speech improved dramatically, and he began participating in other activities for the first time since his stroke. But Max's talents weren't limited to the senior center. Margaret began receiving calls from other facilities. The Cedar Rapids Hospital had heard about Max and asked if he could visit their long-term care unit. The children's wing of the hospital was particularly interested, as they had several young patients who were struggling with extended treatments. Margaret discussed this with Dr. Chen during one of Max's regular checkups. "It's extraordinary, Mrs. Thompson. I've heard about therapy dogs, but Max seems to have an almost supernatural ability to connect with people of all ages. Dr. Chen, is there any medical explanation for what Max does? How does he know exactly how to behave with each person? Some dogs are trained specifically for therapy work, but Max's behavior goes beyond training. He seems to read emotional and physical cues in ways that most humans can't. It's possible that his difficult experiences taught him to be hyper-aware of human distress, but what he's doing now is channeling that awareness into helping rather than just surviving." Margaret thought about this as she watched Max interact with Tommy during one of their weekly visits. Her grandson had become completely attached to Max, and the dog was equally devoted to the little boy. Tommy would whisper secrets to Max, and the dog would listen with complete attention, occasionally licking the child's face when he giggled. "You know, Claire," Margaret told her daughter one evening, "I think finding Max in that box was the best thing that ever happened to all of us." Claire smiled. "Mom, Have you considered pursuing official therapy dog certification for Max? With his natural abilities, it would make it easier to visit more facilities. Margaret had indeed been thinking about this. She'd researched therapy, dog training and certification programs, and while Max already displayed most of the required behaviors naturally, the official certification would open doors to hospitals, schools, and other institutions that required certified therapy animals. She called Dr. Chen the next day with the idea. Dr. Chen, do you know anything about therapy dog certification programs? Actually, Mrs. Thompson, I've been thinking about the same thing. There's an excellent program run by Therapy Dogs International. Given Max's natural abilities and his background, I think he could easily pass their evaluation. I'd be happy to provide his medical clearance and a letter of recommendation. The evaluation process took place 3 weeks later. Margaret was nervous, but Max seemed to understand the importance of the day. The evaluator, a woman named Patricia Wells, who had been training therapy dogs for 15 years, put Max through a series of tests designed to assess his temperament, obedience, and reaction to various scenarios. Max performed flawlessly. He remained calm when Patricia dropped metal objects near him, showed no aggression when she simulated medical procedures, and demonstrated perfect control when other dogs and distractions were introduced to the testing environment. Mrs. Thompson, Patricia said after the evaluation, "In all my years doing this, I've rarely seen a dog with such natural therapeutic instincts. Max doesn't just tolerate the testing scenarios, he actively responds to them in ways that suggest he truly understands his role as a helper." When they received Max's official certification 2 weeks later, Margaret felt a sense of pride and accomplishment that rivaled anything she'd experienced in her professional career. Max seemed to sense the significance too, carrying himself with even more dignity and purpose. Their first official visit as a certified therapy team was back to the senior center, but this time with new confidence and credentials. Harold Peterson had continued to improve, and his daughter Susan now visited with hope rather than despair. "Mrs. Thompson," Susan said after one particularly good visit with her father, "I don't know how to thank you. 6 months ago I thought I'd lost my dad completely. Now we have conversations again. Max gave me back my father." Margaret watched Max lying contentedly at Harold's feet, while the old man told stories about his youth, his voice clear and strong. She thought about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. Tommy's inexplicable awareness, her decision to investigate, Sterling's abandonment of Max, and Max's extraordinary gift for healing. "You know, Max," she whispered to the dog that evening as they sat in her living room, "I think you were meant to be found that day. Not just rescued, but discovered for what you truly are, a healer." Max looked up at her with those knowing eyes and placed his head on her knee as if he agreed completely. Tomorrow they would visit the hospital's pediatric unit for the first time, and Margaret had a feeling that Max was about to touch even more lives in ways she was only beginning to understand. But what Margaret didn't know was that Max's most profound impact was yet to come, in a way that would reveal not only the true depth of his gift, but also bring closure to his own painful past in a manner that no one could have predicted. 6 months after Max's certification as a therapy dog, Margaret received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Monica Foster, the director of the Children's Rehabilitation Center at Cedar Rapids Medical Center. The center specialized in helping children recover from traumatic injuries and cope with long-term disabilities. "Mrs. Thompson, I've heard remarkable things about your dog Max from our colleagues at the senior center. We have a situation here that's quite challenging, and I was hoping you might consider bringing Max for a special visit." Margaret settled into her favorite chair as Dr. Foster explained the situation. "We have an 8-year-old patient named Emma Rodriguez. No relation to Detective Rodriguez, I believe. Emma was in a car accident 4 months ago that left her with a traumatic brain injury. She's made good physical progress, but she hasn't spoken since the accident, despite having no physical damage to her vocal cords or speech centers. Has she been working with speech therapists? Yes, and psychologists as well. Her parents, Maria and Carlos, are at their wits' end. Emma was such a talkative, happy child before the accident. Now she just stares out the window of her room. She won't engage with traditional therapy, won't participate in group activities, and shows little interest in anything we've tried. Margaret felt her heart go out to the family. What makes you think Max might help? Emma's mother mentioned that before the accident, Emma was obsessed with dogs. They were planning to get a family pet for her birthday, which was supposed to be this month. I've seen what therapy dogs can do, but from what I understand, Max has some sort of extraordinary ability to connect with people who are struggling to communicate. Margaret looked at Max, who was resting at her feet but had lifted his head at the mention of his name. He seemed to understand that they were discussing something important. When would you like us to visit? Would tomorrow afternoon be possible? Emma's parents will be there, and we'd like to see if Max can break through in a way that our traditional approaches haven't been able to. The next day, Margaret and Max arrived at the Children's Rehabilitation Center. Dr. Foster met them at the entrance and led them through cheerfully decorated hallways filled with colorful artwork and encouraging messages. Emma's room is down. This hall. Her parents are with her now. I should warn you, she might not acknowledge your presence at all. That's her typical response to new people and situations. As they approached Emma's room, Margaret could see through the open door a small girl sitting in a wheelchair by the window, staring out at the parking lot below. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore a bright yellow sweater that seemed at odds with her listless posture. Margaret knocked gently on the doorframe. Emma? I'm Margaret, and this is my friend Max. Dr. Foster said we could come say hello. Emma's parents, Maria and Carlos, stood up from chairs beside their daughter's bed. They looked exhausted, their faces showing the strain of months of worry and hope deferred. Thank you for coming, Maria said softly. We'll try anything at this point. Margaret entered the room slowly, with Max walking calmly beside her. She had learned to let Max take the lead in these situations, trusting his instincts about how to approach each individual. Max stopped about 6 feet from Emma's wheelchair, sat down, and simply observed her. He didn't move closer, or try to get her attention. He just waited, his dark eyes focused on the little girl with patient intensity. For several minutes, nothing happened. Emma continued staring out the window, seemingly unaware that a large German shepherd was sitting in her room. Margaret began to worry that this might be one situation where even Max's abilities weren't enough. Then, almost imperceptibly, Emma's head turned slightly, not toward Max, but toward the reflection she could see in the window, the reflection of the dog sitting quietly behind her. Max seemed to sense this small movement immediately. He stood up and moved closer, but not directly to Emma. Instead, he positioned himself where she could see him better in the window's reflection without having to turn around fully. Emma's hand, which had been resting limply on the arm of her wheelchair, moved slightly, just her fingertips reaching toward the window, as if she wanted to touch the reflection of the dog. Margaret held her breath. Maria gripped Carlos's hand tightly. Dr. Foster watched with professional fascination as Max made his next move. Slowly, carefully, Max moved to Emma's side, positioning himself so that when she did turn to look at him, it would be a small, manageable movement rather than a major turn of her head. He lay down beside her wheelchair, his head resting on his paws, close enough that she could reach him if she wanted to, but not so close as to feel overwhelming. Emma's eyes moved from the window to look down at Max. For the first time in months, her facial expression changed. It wasn't a smile, but it wasn't the vacant stare they'd grown accustomed to either. It was curiosity. Margaret spoke softly. Max loves to have his ears rubbed, but only if you want to. Emma's hand moved slowly toward Max's head. When her small fingers made contact with his soft ears, Max's tail gave the smallest wag, enough to show he was pleased, but gentle enough not to startle her. For the next 20 minutes, Emma petted Max while he remained perfectly still. Her breathing seemed to deepen, and some of the tension left her shoulders. Maria was crying quietly, the first tears of joy she'd shed in months. Then Max did something unexpected. He shifted his position slightly and placed his head very gently on Emma's lap, looking up at her with those expressive eyes. Emma looked back at him, and for a moment, Margaret saw a flicker of the happy child she must have been before the accident. "Would you like to tell Max your name?" Margaret suggested gently. Emma's lips moved slightly, but no sound came out. Max waited patiently, as if he understood that she was trying to communicate. Dr. Foster stepped forward quietly. "Emma, Max has traveled a long way to meet you. He's very special. He helps people feel better when they're sad or scared." Emma looked at Dr. Foster, then back at Max. Her hand continued stroking his ears as she seemed to consider this information. Margaret decided to share part of Max's story. "Emma, Max used to be very sad too. Someone hurt him and left him alone in a box, but my grandson Tommy found him and helped save him. Now Max helps other people who are sad, just like people helped him." Emma's hand stopped moving. She looked directly at Margaret for the first time, her eyes showing more awareness than they had since she'd arrived at the center. "Max knows what it's like to feel scared and alone," Margaret continued gently. "But he learned that it's okay to trust people again, and it's okay to let them help you." Emma looked back at Max, who had remained perfectly still throughout this exchange. Then, in a voice so quiet it was barely a whisper, she spoke her first words in 4 months. "Hi, Max." The room went completely silent, except for Maria's sharp intake of breath. Carlos put his arm around his wife, both of them staring at their daughter in amazement. Max's tail wagged more enthusiastically now, and he lifted his head slightly to look directly at Emma. She smiled, just a small smile, but it was the first one anyone had seen since the accident. "He likes you," Emma whispered, her voice still barely audible but clear enough for everyone to hear. Dr. Foster had tears in her eyes as she made notes on her tablet. This breakthrough was exactly what Emma's therapy team had been hoping for, a crack in the wall of silence that had surrounded the little girl for months. Margaret and Max spent another hour with Emma, during which she spoke several more times. Short phrases, mostly directed to Max, but words nonetheless. By the time they left, Emma was sitting up straighter in her wheelchair, and there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there when they'd arrived. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Foster said as they walked back to the entrance, "what just happened there was remarkable. In 6 months of working with Emma, we haven't seen anything close to this level of engagement." "Max has a gift," Margaret replied simply. "I'm just the person who gets to accompany him." As they reached the parking lot, Margaret's phone rang. It was Detective Rodriguez. "Mrs. Thompson, I have news about Sterling's case. He's agreed to plead guilty to animal abandonment and neglect charges. Part of his plea agreement includes permanent forfeiture of his rights to Max. The dog is officially yours now." Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Detective, that's wonderful news." "There's more. Sterling has agreed to pay restitution for Max's medical bills and rehabilitation costs." The judge was particularly impressed by the statements from you, Dr. Chen, and the various facilities where Max now works as a therapy dog. Sterling's lawyer tried to argue that Max was just property, but the judge made it clear that in his courtroom, Max's status as a trained therapy animal who provides essential services to the community made him far more than mere property. As Margaret hung up the phone. She looked at Max, who was sitting patiently beside her car. "Did you hear that, Max? You're officially mine now. Well, I suppose I'm officially yours." Max's tail wagged, and he gave her hand a gentle lick. As they drove home, Margaret thought about the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. A discarded dog had become a healer. A lonely grandmother had found new purpose, and together they were touching lives in ways that seemed almost miraculous. But Margaret sensed their story was still unfolding. Max's ability to connect with people who were struggling to communicate suggested that his greatest work might still be ahead of them. She had no idea how prophetic that thought would prove to be, or that Max's next case would challenge everything she thought she understood about the bond between humans and animals. 1 year after finding Max in that cardboard box, Margaret received a call that would bring their story full circle in a way she never could have imagined. It was from Dr. Patricia Wells, the woman who had certified Max as a therapy dog. "Margaret, I have an unusual request. There's a veteran at the VA Medical Center in Iowa City who specifically asked for Max. His name is James Sterling." David Sterling's brother. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "Sterling, the man who abandoned Max?" "Yes, but James is different. He's been following Max's story through the local news and social media. He's a combat veteran who's been struggling with PTSD and hasn't spoken to his brother since he found out what David did to Max. James has severe anxiety and depression, and he specifically requested to meet the dog his brother threw away. He says he wants to apologize on behalf of his family." Margaret wasn't sure how she felt about this request. The thought of anything connecting Max back to Sterling was unsettling, but as she looked at Max, peacefully sleeping in his favorite sunny spot in her living room, she realized the decision wasn't really hers to make alone. "Let me think about it, Dr. Wells. Can I call you back?" That evening, Margaret discussed the situation with Claire during their weekly dinner. Tommy, now 4 and completely devoted to Max, played with his toy cars on the floor while the dog watched him with patient affection. "Mom, what does your instinct tell you?" Claire asked. Margaret watched Max gently nudge one of Tommy's cars back to him when it rolled too far away. "My instinct says Max would want to help anyone who needs it, regardless of their connection to his past. But I'm worried about reopening old wounds. Has Max ever shown any sign of trauma around strangers or new situations?" "No, quite the opposite. If anything, he seems to gravitate toward people who are suffering." The next day, Margaret called. "Dr. Wells back. We'll do it, but I want to meet with the facility's staff first to understand exactly what we're walking into." 2 days later, Margaret and Max drove to the VA Medical Center in Iowa City. Dr. Rachel Kim, the facility's chief psychologist, met them in her office to discuss James Sterling's situation. James is 42 years old, served 3 tours in Afghanistan, and has been struggling with severe PTSD since his discharge 5 years ago. He's made some progress with traditional therapy, but he tends to retreat into himself when dealing with guilt or shame. The situation with his brother and Max has become a fixation for him. He feels responsible for what happened because he introduced David to the idea of using guard dogs in the first place. Margaret frowned. Introduced him. James trained military working dogs overseas. When he came home, he told David about using dogs for security purposes. David saw it as a business opportunity and started buying and training dogs for private security companies. James had no idea David would abuse the animals or discard them when they didn't meet his standards. So James blames himself for Max's suffering. Exactly. He's requested this meeting because he believes apologizing to Max might help him find some peace. It's unconventional, but we're willing to try anything that might help him heal. Dr. Kim led them through the quiet hallways of the medical center to a comfortable room designed for therapy sessions. James Sterling sat in a chair by the window, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He was a tall, thin man with graying hair and tired eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. When Margaret and Max entered the room, James looked up with a mixture of nervousness and hope. Max immediately focused on him, tilting his head slightly in that way he did when assessing someone's emotional state. "Mr. Sterling, I'm Margaret Thompson, and this is Max." James stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the dog. "Mrs. Thompson, thank you for coming. I know this must be strange for you." Margaret guided Max closer, watching carefully for both men's reactions. The human who carried guilt and the dog who had every reason to fear anyone with the Sterling name. But Max showed no fear. Instead, he approached James with the same gentle confidence he displayed with all the people he visited. He sat in front of James and looked up at him with those intelligent, compassionate eyes. James slowly sank back into his chair, his composure beginning to crumble. "I'm so sorry," he whispered to Max. "I'm so sorry for what my brother did to you. I taught him about working dogs, but I never imagined he would hurt them." Tears began streaming down James's face. "I can't sleep at night knowing that my knowledge was used to harm innocent animals. Every dog I worked with overseas was a hero. They saved lives, including mine, and my brother turned that into something ugly." Max stood up and moved closer to James, gently placing his head on the man's knee. James's hands shook as he reached down to stroke Max's fur. "You deserved so much better," James continued, his voice breaking. "All those dogs did. I've been trying to shut down David's operation, but the legal process is slow, and I know there might be other dogs suffering." Margaret felt her heart breaking for this man who was torturing himself over something that wasn't truly his fault. She looked at Dr. Kim, who nodded encouragingly. "Mr. Sterling," Margaret said gently, "Max doesn't hold grudges. Look at him, he's trying to comfort you. He knows you're not the same person as your brother." James looked down at Max, who had now positioned himself so the man could pet him more easily. "How can he be so forgiving after what David did to him?" "Because that's who Max is," Margaret explained. "He chooses to focus on helping people heal rather than dwelling on past hurt. Maybe you could honor his example by doing the same for yourself." Over the next hour, James spoke about his experiences with military working dogs, his guilt over his brother's actions, and his struggle to find meaning in his civilian life. Max remained close to him throughout, providing silent comfort and support. Dr. Kim later told Margaret it was the most progress James had made in months of therapy. As they prepared to leave, James made an unexpected request. "Mrs. Thompson, would it be possible for me to visit Max again? And would you consider letting me help with his therapy work? I know I don't deserve it, but I'd like to find a way to make amends." Margaret looked at Max, who was sitting calmly beside James, his tail wagging slightly. "I think Max would like that very much." 3 months later, James Sterling had become a regular volunteer with Max's therapy program. He helped transport Max to various facilities, assisted with training sessions, and even started working with other therapy dog teams. His military experience with working dogs proved invaluable, and his dedication to Max's work gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since leaving the service. On the first anniversary of finding Max, Margaret organized a celebration at the Senior Center. Harold Peterson, now walking with just a cane and speaking clearly, gave a speech about how Max had helped him find his voice again. Emma Rodriguez, who had returned to school and was thriving in her recovery, sent a video message about her special friend, Max, who had taught her that it was okay to trust again. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when James Sterling approached Margaret during the celebration. "Mrs. Thompson, I wanted you to know that Max didn't just save my brother's victim. He saved me too. Working with him has given me back my purpose and helped me forgive myself. I've decided to start a non-profit organization dedicated to rescuing and rehabilitating abused working dogs. Margaret smiled, watching Max surrounded by all the people whose lives he had touched. James, I think Max would be honored to be the inspiration for that. As the celebration continued, Margaret reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them all together. A 3-year-old boy's mysterious intuition had led to the rescue of a discarded dog who had then become a healer, touching dozens of lives. An abandoned animal had brought together a community of people dedicated to compassion and recovery. Tommy, now 5, ran up to Margaret and Max, throwing his arms around the big dog's neck. "Grandma, tell me again how I found Max." Margaret smiled, stroking both Tommy's hair and Max's fur. "You didn't just find him, sweetheart. You recognized that he was meant to be part of our family." Max looked up at Margaret with those wise, gentle eyes, and she could swear he was smiling. He had gone from being seen as defective property to becoming an irreplaceable healer. His greatest gift wasn't his training as a guard dog, but his ability to see past his own suffering and dedicate his life to helping others heal from theirs. As the sun set through the windows of the senior center, Margaret watched Max move from person to person, bringing comfort, joy, and hope wherever he went. She thought about all the lives that had been changed because a little boy had insisted they stop and investigate a mysterious box on the sidewalk. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the simplest acts of compassion. Sometimes a discarded life becomes a source of healing for many. And sometimes, just sometimes, what appears to be an ending is really the beginning of something beautiful beyond imagination. Dear friends, we hope Max and Margaret's incredible journey has touched your hearts as much as it has touched ours. This true story of resilience, compassion, and second chances reminds us that sometimes the most broken souls have the greatest capacity to heal others. If this story moved you, we invite you to join our community of storytellers and animal lovers. Subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales that celebrate the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals. Click the like button if Max's story inspired you, and share your own stories of animal rescue and healing in the comments below. Every week, we bring you new stories that explore the incredible ways animals enrich our lives and teach us about love, forgiveness, and hope. Don't miss our upcoming features, including the story of a rescue horse that became a therapy animal for children with autism, and the tale of a shelter cat whose purrs helped heal patients in a pediatric hospital. Your engagement helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of compassion and transformation. We can't wait to hear how Max's story has impacted you, and we look forward to sharing more incredible journeys with you soon.